Excited to have you as part of it. If you are not familiar and we haven't met, my name is Amanda Bassos. I am the Regional Resource Director for Caring Treatment Centers here in South Florida. Today we are hosting this webinar entitled Women's Wellness, How to be Gender Responsive and Understand the Female Impact on Family Systems. So thank you again for joining. And we are conducting today's presentation in a webinar format, meaning all microphones are muted. And while we can't see you or hear you, you are able to see and hear us. So during the presentation, please feel free to use the Q&A box down at the bottom of your screen or the chat box, whatever you're comfortable is. We would love for this to be interactive, and certainly if any questions come up throughout the presentation, don't hesitate to put that in. We will definitely answer any Q&A at the end. And if for some reason we run out of time, as this is an hour, if we don't get to your question by the end of the hour, we will have someone from our team follow up directly with you by the end of the week so we can answer those questions. So today's presentation is eligible for 1 social work credit. And we'd like to thank our educational sponsor, Jumana Grassi, for her assistance in securing these credits. So in order to receive your credit today, you have to stay on for the duration of the webinar. And once the webinar has ended, the eval will appear on your screen. Once you've finished the eval, give about 2 weeks or so for the delivery of your certificate to arrive via email. And if for some reason that doesn't come through within 2 weeks, don't hesitate to reach out and we will investigate on our end. So today we are joined by a panel of wonderful women who will give us varied perspectives and share their expertise on today's topic. First on our panel, we have Amy D'Arcangelo. She is a family and recovery coach at Feinberg Consulting here in Florida. Also, we have Natalie Cohen, who is an associate at the law firm of Hark, Yon, and Marmer here in Boca Raton. And we also have Meg Seidman, a therapist in private practice here in South Florida. Finally, on our panel, we have Josephine Tynes, who is the executive director of Caring Director, Administrative for Run. Relationships with clients, with their families, and of course with professionals like yourselves throughout the community. Before taking on the role of executive director here in Florida, Josie was actually the clinical director for Caring Ocean Drive, where she provided clinical leadership to ensure that the services provided to clients and families adhered to Ocean Drive's high standard of excellence. She earned her bachelor's and master's degrees in social work from Florida Atlantic University, as well as a master's in healthcare leadership from Brown University. So we are grateful for all of these women giving their time today to share and teach us. And I will officially hand the presentation over to Josie to get us started.
Thanks so much, Amanda. Just to give a little background on all of the wonderful women that we have here with us today, I wanted to give you a little bit of a bio on each woman. So starting with Amy. Amy has over a decade of experience supporting families, challenging unhealthy family patterns, and helping families improve communication to heal. She's a certified addiction counselor. Natalie Cohen, who is an associate at the law firm of Hark, Yon, and Marmor, is located in Boca Raton, Florida. She concentrates her practice in the areas of guardianship, mental health, and Marchman Act proceedings. She's a member of the Florida Bar, South Palm Beach County and Palm Beach County Bar Associations, Florida Association of Women Lawyers, and the Italian American Bar Association. Next, we have Meg Seidman. Meg's a licensed mental health counselor specializing in treating acute and developmental trauma. Meg has extensive training in advanced clinical modalities, including EMDR, NARM, cognitive behavioral therapy, dialectical behavioral therapy, and motivational interviewing. Her primary focus is treating individuals suffering from PTSD and symptoms stemming from complex trauma, addiction, personality disorders, mood disorders, family systems issues, and LGBTQ+ issues. Meg provides individual counseling, couples counseling, family therapy, and group therapy. Now, before we get started and I hand it over to Amy, I really just wanted to say how wonderful it is to be surrounded by such a talented panel of women. You know, given that it's Women's History Month and National Women's Month, I would love to, just get this started and get our panel started, because I'm so excited for just the empowerment that is here on this webinar and the talent and the skill that I'm surrounded by. So with that, I will hand it off to Amy.
Thanks, Josie. Thanks, Amanda, for the introductions. I'm honored to be here and to be able to share with everyone, especially with it being Women's Month. That's a meaningful time for me, and wanting to show up and be able to help as many women as possible that are in search, or maybe not quite yet in search, which is where I come in, of a better way to live and a better way to take care of themselves and those around them. So I'm currently, I am a family coach and interventionist for Feinberg Consulting. When you were doing Meg's introduction, you had mentioned NARM, and NARM has changed the way that we have been doing interventions, and especially with women. The one thing that's for sure is there's a strong link with substance abuse and alcoholism and trauma. And because of that, our approach, and my approach, in interventions on, and when we talk of interventions, we typically think of, the female that needs help. With what I do, it's I see it as multiple interventions, because I'm oftentimes intervening on a family system and on someone that needs a little more help. So there's multiple interventions taking place throughout our process. And the goal, my approach and the goal is always on how are we going to step in and help the family that so badly needs help and assistance. They're, family systems that if you love someone with alcoholism or addiction, or have somebody in your family, you've oftentimes collected your own traumas throughout that experience. So the intervention with family and the women that I've recently been encountering, I try to keep at the forefront of my mind how I'm going to do this in such a way that provides them all with some relief, support, love, and answers, rather than, kind of the old style of interventions that most people think of. Because that's, we're intervening on people that have been traumatized, families and women alike. Most recently, the interventions have taken a different course based on just the woman's role in family systems. Women are oftentimes the caretakers, and that does impact how we are facilitating interventions. It's very difficult for most females to step in and ask them to do something so life-changing and to leave their lives. It's interventions on the females I've recently been facilitating. They have very full lives. We're intervening on, especially today, the current situations, women who have children, careers, their wives, they're taking care of their parents, and that's been some of my most recent interventions. So you're taking oftentimes the glue in the middle of a family and asking them to leave to take care of themselves, when instinctually for most females, caretaking is very, very strong, right? We women are caretakers, and oftentimes the intervention is set up to facilitate being able to provide some relief for whatever they've been experiencing. There are, and I'm sorry, you can move to the next slide. I probably, thank you. So in care confronting, which is what we currently are trying to do more of, rather than if you don't do this, we will do this. That's not the approach. oftentimes I mentioned the trauma that a lot of women have, alcoholics and addicts have experienced. Those kinds of situations are re-traumatizing. So instead, I up front, when I start working with the family system, I talk to them about the environment and the situation we want to create, because an intervention is about creating a situation that, instead of, the threatening and you need to go do this, we create a situation where we're providing help with the family and the woman that we're attempting to help. In order to do that, a lot of times there's a lot of barriers in place and objections, which is a lot of interventions today are, where will the kids, how do they get to school? Who's going to take them to, and these are our females' lives, who's going to be taking them to practice? Who's going to take care of the animals? Who's going to, where there's a list of objections that most females that I've been intervening on have, and they're real. These are real objections. So a lot of interventions, we come up with plans to make this as seamless as possible, because in order to ask someone to leave their lives, and sometimes today, the way, we're doing better at setting up treatment to be able to do treatment and have them live their lives simultaneously. But in order to ask someone to go put themselves first and to take care of whatever they're experiencing, you need to have some answers. It's a lot. It's a big ask for most women. So a couple of the things that we've encountered is, we've talked, and you've probably read a lot about fighting the stigma of alcoholism and addiction. And that is one of the major things we're encountering. Is I just recently had an intervention. She was a very successful real estate agent. Finances aren't the issue. There's no bottom lines to put in place there. This is more of, the myth that we fought on that one was everything she was on was being prescribed. She wasn't doing anything that was not on a written prescription from a doctor. However, she was pretty far into an addiction, and it was impacting her emotionally, her health. She couldn't show up properly for her children. She was physically present, but not able to function the way, So we're a lot of times also we're battling a lot of these myths, a lot of these stigmas around this, you have to be under a bridge with a bottle of wine kind of mindset of no, that's not what this is, especially in our current day with everything that's been asked of women recently. With the pandemic, and you have to homeschool, you have to keep your career going, you have to take care of everyone and everything. What I'm currently encountering is a much different type of intervention than I've seen before. So I have a list there of important things, that we use, and you can go on to the next slide. I think it's about the myths. And I just put a few on there for examples. That the other one is, this is temporary, this is because of the current thing that's happening right now in our world. And there's a lot of family systems that protect an alcoholic or addict. And so the first intervention I do is always on a family system. And we at the very beginning, interventions are always thought of at the beginning. However, what we're doing is I'm constantly evaluating the family system and the care that they will need throughout the process. When we do get somebody to agree to treatment or to getting help, we also want the family involved. It really ups the chances. And a lot of times it's, let's send so-and-so away, and she will take care of, she won't drink anymore, or she'll be weaned off of all of the pills she's taking, and she'll be fine. And really the family system is what needs to change, the entire family system, because there are a lot of stressors today that are too much for women. And staying sober is also, a family system job. Them joining recovery is is very helpful. It's not impossible if they don't, but I right away ask the family when they say they want to perform an intervention, if they're willing to do their work, because that is a big part of it. And you can go on to the next slide, please. So when we look at interventions today, the intervention is not only on the female that's needing help, it's on the family, which is a lot of times they're not expecting that. So we do battle a lot of old patterns, and interrupting those can be difficult. There's at the beginning, Feinberg, we start looking at what is this family going to need post-treatment. And so the intervention process isn't just about the beginning, it's about what do they need post-treatment and what can we help with when they're leaving to go back into the real world, because that's typically where the struggle comes in, right? Once you get someone into treatment, there's changes that happen there, but without some support and help after, it can be very difficult for the change to be long lasting. So those are and the intervention process is another piece that we've done a lot of work with. I frame it as we're writing a love letter. You see the interventions read in the letters. We write love letters. We don't write, you do this or I'll do this letters. It's not helpful, especially to people who have had a list of traumas usually. We want to look at their behaviors as their communication, and the communication, what they're saying is, I am in an environment and situation that I can no longer tolerate. Please help me. So a lot of the work is preparing families for that. Families still have a lot of old thoughts on they're doing something wrong. They're, bad, they're secretive, they're lying, and these things. So we really try to reframe that for a family so they can provide the right environment. And that piece is the most important thing for an intervention, is that we set the right environment out of love. And you would think that would be easy. It's not. Families are angry, they're hurt, they feel betrayed. They see a lot of the behaviors as, character defects, and they're bad or they're wrong. And we have to really help the family reframe that into, no, they're in a lot of pain and they need help. And that's a big job. So that is, we're not going and pulling drunks out from under bridges. We're intervening on successful women who are having a hard time because the stressors are overwhelming and their traumas are overwhelming. And a lot of the women I'm encountering feel like they're failing. And that is where we can step in and heal and try to provide, some love, I think, is the overall mindset that we want to come from for people who have been traumatized. And the next piece is, if they're not willing and they're deep into their addiction, we reach out to people like Natalie, that, we don't stop. We still want to love them, but we may need to take a different approach. And we do bottom lines and things like that when needed. But those are the last resort in my efforts. So that's when I would reach out to someone like Natalie and say, help. We have somebody that needs help, and they're not there yet. So we need to do something a little different. I think that's all. If
Thanks.
has questions.
Thank you so much, Amy. That was absolutely wonderful. And as you said, you might reach out to Natalie at that point. And in that same breath, Natalie, we will turn it over to you.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. And thank you, Amanda and Josie, and for inviting me on this panel and for setting this up. And it's such an important issue. And so I'm an attorney. I deal with mental health law. I deal specifically with Marchman Acts this past year, and to be honest, it's been quite busy. And taking off of what Amy said a little bit, just in how it's affected women, right? This past year's just been quite a bit. I mean, for all women, and trying to just work from home and handle all of the stressors that I guess we've all been dealing with. But those trying to deal with work and homeschooling, all of those things. So it's been a busy year. I just wanted to read a part of the statute, it's the intent of the Marchman Act, because I think it's really important. I guess attorneys aren't really known for their empathy, right? But when you approach any kind of legal proceeding dealing with mental health, I think it's really important to come from a place of empathy, and not, these are not meant to be punitive, right? These are, this was a statute enacted to help the family. And so one part in its statute, Florida Statute 397305, subsection 1, I'm just going to read one sentence, but it just says substance abuse impairment is a disease which affects the whole family and the whole society, and requires a system of care that includes prevention, intervention, clinical treatment, and recovery support services that support and strengthen the family union. And so that is the primary focus and goal and the intent of the legislation when they pass the statute, right? And so it's to get somebody the help that they need. And we know sometimes when people are in the throes of addiction, and, you know, compounded by several other issues, especially this past year, you know, it's hard to see what kind of help they need. And oftentimes they want to kind of steer the ship or be in control. And so the thing is, we defer to all of you in the court system, in the judges and attorneys. We defer to people involved in the facilities and clinical care. You are our experts. So you dictate the treatment. We're just kind of here to help you facilitate that process, right? For the person who's having a hard time taking that initial step, or is having a hard time staying once they are there, okay? So there are two parts. Well, and I want to just touch on the fact that the Marchman Act is a sealed proceeding, kind of dictated more by administrative orders, but very serious about that. And that, you know, transcends socioeconomic brackets, and so all kinds of careers, right? And it's nothing to be ashamed of. But it is something that's helpful, I think, for interventionists sometimes to have in their back pocket if it's known to them that perhaps this may be a more difficult case, or if, you know, there's that kind of a situation. I stay in my lane, though, so I kind of defer to all of you or anyone involved in clinical care to know when somebody like me might need to come into play. Specifically, there are two parts to a Marchman Act, and I remind people, because when I obtain the first order, a lot of times people think it's over. And so there's really two separate case numbers, two phases to a Marchman Act. And I'm just going to go through that, so I'm sure you all know. But I think for women, you know, the initial phase is the hard phase, because when we touch on childcare, even home care, just kind of overseeing, you know, other family members too. We have women who have to take care of parents, right? Elderly parents. And so, you know, there's so many different roles that women play or deal with. And so, you know, these are things that we have to discuss with the families. And when I'm engaged, the families are my clients, typically, you know, they are scared and sad and angry, and there's a lot of emotion. So when I say we come from a place of empathy, it's not just with the person who's you know, trying to get into treatment, which, you know, we call the respondent, but it's also all of the family members, right? And just trying to understand and make sure that that's a real primary focus. And I think the court system is done fairly well with that. I really do believe, you know, everybody understands what the primary purpose is. And so the assessment and stabilization phase is basically, you know, to get somebody into detox. And one good thing about a Marchman Act order that we are allowed to file what's called an emergency ex parte petition for an assessment and stabilization, but we are able to obtain a pickup order to transport somebody to whatever stabilizing facility is recommended or referred, you know, by everyone involved. And so I think that's been helpful for, you know, I don't know how many women are, you know, real gung-ho about leaving their family unit, right, or leaving their kids and thinking everything is going to be great. I think it's a real, sometimes a deterrent that, you know, that we don't we don't understand unless you're really in that place, right? Especially for people with small children, but also those with teenagers, right? Because those kids, while they're suffering some, issues, they're more aware. I have found this year, I get the calls from family or clients is that, we knew it was bad, but we didn't realize how bad, right? We didn't realize until we were all home together. And, I think we had some people that were maybe functioning better in the family unit's mind, that when everybody's stuck at home, it's just really obvious, and more people became more aware. So it's a lot of stress for women, to try to handle all of that and deal with it on a good day. And then when you're trying to deal with all of, what Amy touched on, some trauma issues and substance abuse or alcohol issues. So, this is a good statute to have. Not every state has it. So I think here in Florida, we're lucky to have it. Can be filed at different phases. It can be filed if somebody's home. It can be filed if somebody's in treatment and they've indicated they want to leave, and they have a history of not completing care or, discharging against medical advice. I mean, there's different times that it would come into play. And then the second phase is the treatment phase, which is when you obtain what's called, the order for involuntary services for up to 90 days, which can be extended for another 90 if necessary. And that is an umbrella of an order that we defer to all of you, the experts who are dealing with the family units, and obviously the patient who's receiving the care. So it's a really important statute. I think it's been helpful. And obviously it's imperative that for the family unit that mom's well, but I think mom sometimes my experience, women, we put ourselves last. And so it's just a good thing to have for people that are having a hard time understanding that that's what they need. I'm going to go ahead and move on to the second slide, which I also deal with mental health, and I wanted to just touch on that. That's after a period of sobriety, if there's continued mental health or noncompliance with medications. But I think the important component, from my perspective as an attorney in dealing with this, so when we focus on women, right, is everything should be on a very limited basis in dealing with the court system, right? We should kind of be the last resort. I don't think it's, something that is necessarily for every case, right? And it's the same thing with an ETG, an emergency temporary guardianship, or limited guardianship, or plenary guardianship. These are the cases that, it doesn't necessarily have to be so egregious, or somebody's, like Amy said, under a bridge with a bottle. It has to be perhaps somebody who's had no attempts, or nobody's asked them or approached them, and it's not even been on the table, right? Like, so I get called, when things get pretty, it's difficult to get the person the help that they need. And so I do think it's important to include the ETG and kind of the guardianship component, because I've seen quite a bit of that too. And also it's dealing with substance abuse, but when somebody has a period of sobriety, then, there's also, they're not taking their meds, and there's that component. And, when you want to get the full benefits of care, right, and whatever the clinical team is attempting or trying to do for somebody, there's a lot of things that are involved in that. And so it's not necessarily, obviously none of this is punitive, but if there's continued psychotic behaviors or things like that of that nature, that's where I step in. And I've been able, because of the pandemic, to do it all over the state, right, because we're Zooming. And so it's a temporary order. So the ETG I like because it's a 90-day order that expires similar to a Marchman Act on its face. It's a sealed proceeding. So if you're in need of that, obviously, after somebody's had a period of sobriety and there's some concerns, that's something to think about, because you have a different, it's a higher level, quite frankly, of an order. I'm going ahead and to the next slide is dealing with the guardianship, and that's when Amy touched upon dealing with as an interventionist or in the initial phase, the family unit. I as an attorney am aware that there's family stuff going on, right? I don't, my education is not in clinical services. So like I said, I stay very much in my lane. I have that openness. And so when we're dealing with anything other than the Marchman Act, because the Marchman Act is the court oversight, right? You have an order where essentially the judge is in charge, okay? With a guardianship, it's a little different. It's the family is kind of in charge. And so, you know, I'm aware as an attorney that we have to be careful there too, right? So we want to make sure that there's not a control thing, etc. So I defer again to you, all the clinical team, and I'll have some conversations that if it's appropriate. So those are some things. I will say, I had a case recently where somebody was suffering, a young woman, so my son's 15, she had a 15-year-old son. And it's a hard age because your son's not only aware that obviously you're dealing with some stuff, right? They know something's wrong, but here, now mom's gonna go somewhere for at least 30 days, probably more, to receive some treatment in the middle of COVID while he's home, you know, trying to Zoom. And, you know, initially it was, and I represent both sides, just so you all know. I'm open. I have also represented respondents, and this was that case. And it is good for me sometimes to, you know, still hear their concerns, because I'm aware that as an attorney, as a filing petitioning attorney. And so it ended up being a really great thing for the family unit. She had some physical health issues that led her to, you know, obviously to abusing some substances that she was prescribed, and you know, we had the bases covered that Amy touched upon. We had everything covered so that while she was receiving her care, you know, there was no concern about her son. And, you know, she got to go home, do the IOP, etc., and everything's still going very well. It was the best feedback that I had heard, so I don't get to do that very much. And to really understand, I mean, that's what everybody's dealing with. That's the fear. So it's like, kind of know you need help, but hey, I don't want to hurt everyone getting the help. And you try to explain, you know, doing the best thing. But nonetheless, it's a good statute, I think, to have in your back pocket. It's something, you know, that some families need. And it's basically, you know, there are certain statutory requirements to meet. So, but when people are in this place, they often meet them, you know. I don't think that everybody's able to appreciate their need for services. Otherwise, you know, it wouldn't be so hard to get the help that they need. So, anyway, thank you so much for letting me participate in this great group of women panel. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Natalie. And I'm actually going to take a few minutes now to just go over some statistics about women and the COVID-19 pandemic. And then I'm also going to speak very briefly about how we at Caring of Florida view these sensitive issues associated with women and treating women as well. So Caren's Chief Medical Officer, Dr. Joseph Garbley, has actually said that the number of female patients coming into treatment at Caren with liver disease or severe medical issues has significantly grown within the past year. In a few cases, patients have been actually transferred to outside hospitals upon admission for detoxification and have only been able to return to treatment once stabilized. We're also seeing an increase in anxiety and depression related to COVID-19, and this is particularly true for women. I think something that Natalie just said speaks to this, and that oftentimes I find that we put ourselves last and take care of everyone around us first, and tend to suppress that anxiety, and which oftentimes leads to depression or the feeling of a gray cloud kind of following over our heads wherever we go. Finally, there's another finding that women are more likely to experience severe psychological stress than men, which is also consistent with previous studies globally that have shown that we as women experience more anxiety and depression, which I think, again, kind of is supported by the previous statistic and my previous statement. So I want to just speak briefly about, just give an overview of the treatment process at Caring in Florida and our treatment process with women. So starting at assessment, one thing and admission that I want to highlight is our admissions process involves a thorough assessment. And one thing that we have actually, and is really important to us, is to have both female and male admissions specialists
to make sure that when someone calls in, if a woman is more comfortable talking to another woman, that we're able to have those needs met. We also look at gathering collateral information from the family, like both Amy and Natalie highlighted, and require that family members or other people in the identified patient's life that could be seen as family. Sometimes it's business partners, sometimes trust officers, guardians, depending upon what the presenting problems are and what the patient's individual issues are. We require that all of those individuals be part of the admissions process. As far as assessment, we want to make sure that assessments done upon admission to treatment, once a woman has actually begun treatment with us, are going to be multifaceted, and also looking at biopsychosocial, spiritual assessments. And one step that we've been moving toward organizationally and in Cairn, Florida as well is becoming a trauma-informed care agency. So making sure that all of these assessments, all of the language on all of our forms and documents are trauma-informed in nature, and we're actually being sensitive to whatever issues that a woman might have coming into treatment. And we also know that a lot of the time, the really, really painful stuff is the stuff that we actually don't talk about and we don't want to bring up initially. So being mindful of what's not only being said as part of the assessment process, but more importantly, what's not being said. Treatment planning involves both the patient and the family, also any collateral providers. So if there's a Marchman Act attorney, such as Natalie, if there's an interventionist, such as Amy, say the patient was working with Meg in private practice prior to being referred to a higher level of care, we ask that there be releases signed for all of the other professionals involved in the patient's care. And we really want to make sure that the treatment planning process is more than just a document, but it's actually a fluid process that helps meet not only the patient's goals, but also the family's goals and collateral providers' goals as well. And as far as discharge planning, we believe that that should begin upon admission. So again, just weaving that thread of collateral providers and individuals that are important in a patient's life to make sure that the biopsychosocial, spiritual needs are met of each patient prior to discharge, and that the discharge plan is completed with the primary therapist, family therapist, medical providers, our aftercare coordinators, and also looking at involvement with our alumni and really, really honing in on a warm handoff process to whatever provider would be working with that patient in the community thereafter. So with that being said, I'm going to hand it off to Meg. I want to be mindful of time and make sure she has enough time to say everything that she needs to say. So there you go.
Thank you, Josie. So as I was so nicely introduced, my name is Meg. I am a licensed mental health counselor in private practice, and I do specialize in treating trauma. We can go ahead and move to the next slide. So when we're looking at trauma, one of the biggest and most important steps that we're thankfully moving towards is really expanding the definition of trauma. Oftentimes, when people think about trauma and PTSD, it's related to shock trauma. So that's looking at something like a car accident or an assault or a natural disaster. Thankfully, the field is moving towards looking at a broader definition of trauma to include what is being referred to as complex PTSD. And this includes attachment trauma, relational trauma, developmental trauma, intergenerational trauma, and cultural trauma, which is specifically important when we're talking about women and looking at the impact of systemic oppression, of sexual assault, of domestic violence within families. When we look at the risk for women, unfortunately, the APA does find that women are twice as likely to develop a diagnosis of PTSD. The Adverse Childhood Experiences Study, which was geared towards looking at complex trauma, also shows that women are more likely to experience neglect and abuse and adverse household experiences that are associated with these types of, or this type of symptomology. Intergenerational trauma, one that I trip over every time I say it, is trauma that extends over generations. So we're looking at the impact that is passed down through our parents and through our grandparents, and really looking to include the whole family system in trauma work, which is definitely a step out of just having the quote unquote victim of the trauma being the one involved in therapy. And we can go ahead and move to the next slide. So specifically with me working in private practice, I get clients coming in at various stages of trauma work treatment. There are 3 specific stages. The first has primarily to do with establishing safety and stabilization. Establishing safety has to do both within the therapeutic relationship. It's important to take into consideration whether or not the client wants to be working with a female or male therapist, depending on their experiences. It's also important that the client wants to be in treatment. A lot of trauma work has to do with a lack of consent. So not consenting to treatment can be re-traumatizing, especially if they're looking to do trauma work. The stabilization process has to do with a lot of psychoeducation, creating safety within their home and within their family and their relationships, as well as learning grounding tools for dealing with trauma responses. Unfortunately, a lot of women in particular will stop doing trauma work following this first stage of treatment. It is typically the longest stage and the one where people are seeing the most reduction in the symptoms that typically bring them into therapy. So when flashback stops, when the intrusive thoughts stop, when anxiety is reduced, individuals will then move back into their life and stop therapy, and unfortunately not complete the full process of healing. The second stage is more about processing and grieving the actual traumatic memories associated with these traumatic experiences. This largely involves some of the treatment approaches that you see listed below on the slide, and many of them involve vivid recall of the traumatic memories. Specifically, CBT and EMDR are what we call very stimulating therapies. So oftentimes we'll see having to move back kind of into this first stage of trauma therapy, going back over the grounding skills and including some of this creating safety. And then the third stage of treatment is about expanding connections. We all come into the world kind of wired for connection, and unfortunately trauma does work to rewire our brains for protection. So a big stage of working with, or a big process with working with trauma, is helping individuals to reconnect with their family, their friends, their activities, their jobs, which is why maintenance of trauma therapy is so important, and not just to reduce symptom reduction. And I've listed a couple. I'm not going to go into detail with the different treatment approaches. There's numerous types of modalities for addressing trauma. CBT and EMDR do tend to be the most specifically when looking at shock trauma. A few individuals had mentioned NARM, which stands for the Neuroaffective Relational Model, which is a modality specifically oriented with dealing with complex PTSD, and it's a body-oriented approach. We can go on over to the next slide now. Okay. So barriers specifically for women, I mean, for everyone, there's of course financial constraints. Women are also commonly faced with time constraints. There is a low mental health literacy when it comes to trauma work. Expanding the definition of trauma is a huge part of this, so that individuals can start to have some validation for the fact that what they are experiencing is a symptom of trauma. There is stigma, shame, fears of rejection associated with engaging in trauma work. There's, of course, lack of knowledge and treatment doubts in general. There's financial constraints, fear of negative social consequences. Unfortunately, there's often a lot of encouragement not to engage in trauma work, not to want to be labeled as a victim, and trauma-specific barriers of simply not wanting to talk about it. One of the biggest pieces that come up when engaging in trauma work is this fear of, if I open the door, things are going to get worse, and I have a family to take care of, and I have work to get to, and I just kind of want to power through and not have to take the time to think about it. So a lot of it is just kind of giving the space to open up about these things and take care of themselves. There's a huge need for an increase in trauma-specific training, both in schools, within the mental health community, and within law enforcement, and increased services for female survivors and their families. Families also need a lot of support in understanding how to best support someone that they loved who's experienced a traumatic incident. And unfortunately, the resources for that are limited, especially now with everything on Zoom. Connection has, of course, taken a hit as well. So there's been a lot of pop-ups in terms of support groups for connecting for survivors to help with this as well. And that's the end of my slide. So Josie, back to you.
Thank you so much, Meg, and thank you so much, Natalie and Amy as well. I'm actually going to turn it back over to Amanda so she can take some time to field any Q&A that we might have from any of the participants.
Absolutely. Thank you. Thank you, ladies. That was wonderful. I know I'll speak on behalf of all of our attendees that was incredibly informative and very thoughtful. People in general need our support, and women especially right now. So I loved how, again, intentional the work that you were able to speak to the work that you do. We did have a few questions come through, and if any of our attendees have additional questions right now, feel free to plug them into the chat or the Q&A, and we can go ahead and ask over the next few minutes. But the first question is for Natalie. Can you confirm if the Marchman Act is state or federally mandated?
It is state. So it's actually a county judge order. And so ideally it's in the county where you're receiving your care. So we need transport to the facility, et cetera. It's an easier, logistically, it's an easier process. It's a state order. It's not a federal order, and it's sealed. So once again, I kind of want to reiterate that. Doesn't mean that it can be found by a federal background check, let's be honest. But thus far, we've been very, courts are very careful. They want people to feel comfortable getting the help they need, family members to use the Marchman Act. So, but yeah, it's a state process.
Wonderful, thank you. And as a follow-up to that question, if an individual is not a resident of the state of Florida, can a Marchman Act still apply if they're coming to Florida for care?
It can only be initiated once somebody is in Florida. So I have spoken to family members outside of the state, right? But the plan is that the person is going to travel to Florida to, obtain treatment. Yeah, the Marchman Act can be filed once they land. So we kind of just wait for the call. And so at that point, for this purpose, for this statute, they're considered a resident. Obviously, it's not a permanent status, but for legal proceedings, it's, yeah. So.
Perfect. Thank you so much. The next question is actually for Meg. What advice would you provide for professionals in our industry working with a female who has shame with identifying or opening up about their trauma?
Thank you, Amanda. So, I mean, working with shame is a huge piece of any trauma treatment. I think that my kind of very short answer, so I don't go off for the next 10 minutes, is to work in the relationship. So much of trauma therapy is relational based, so giving a safe space to work through and process through what the shame means for her. What the fears are associated with opening up about these things, finding out what parts of it she's identifying with and personifying and integrating into her self-worth. But really starting with the relationship. That is an incredibly simplistic answer, but the best one I can do in about a minute. So happy to add more to that if anyone wants to reach out to me offline.
Wonderful, thank you, thank you. The next question is actually for Amy. How do you recommend supporting a family who is unwilling to participate in the intervention process and the care for their loved one?
I just want to clarify your question. How to support a family that doesn't want to participate?
It sounds like it's a question in terms of if the family unit, the family system is not willing to engage, how can you still provide that family-based intervention?
Mm-hmm. So typically if I have a family system that's resistant to intervening, to doing these things, I would try my best to find, even if it's just one family member that's willing to work with me and to make some movement there. If there's somebody that needs to be intervened on and they don't have a supportive family system, I would then reach out to their peers, to other supports around them if family's resistant. I think a lot of times I actually just did an intervention with 4 friends that and family was involved, but they were very unhealthy. So instead, we set up an intervention with her closest friends. They had known each other for many years. So it is possible. I try to find the people that are going to be meaningful. I'm actually getting ready to do an intervention in Michigan, and I'm bringing in his old coach, his old baseball coach. Family isn't that supportive. They don't know what's happening and resistant to letting other family members know what's happening. So we're bringing in people that are meaningful and going to, hit that spot in him that reminds him of who he was, is what I'm looking for, not who he is currently. So.
Great. Thank you. Thank you for that. And the next question is actually for Josie. Can you define specifically what gender-specific treatment looks like at Caron, Florida?
Absolutely. So at Caron, Florida, we have specific gender groups to have both at Ocean Drive and at Caron Renaissance multiple times a week to separate out any, gender-specific issues. If a woman were in need of gender-specific treatment, then part of our assessment process during pre-admission would be to look at maybe Caron, Pennsylvania women's programming would be the primary treatment to start, and then looking at after Caron, Florida. One thing that's really important to us is to make sure that we place people in the appropriate program and know what we're really good at, and maybe what we could also utilize some of our other outside partners or our other locations for as well.
Wonderful. Thank you for that. And I think we have time for one more question. And this is also for Meg. What are you seeing today, right now, in the presentations of trauma with your clients that are specifically a result of this past year with everything related to COVID?
Of course. So, I'm seeing a lot more isolation, of course, kind of just given the climate, as well as hypervigilance. A lot of what I've seen happening is people with pre-existing trauma, which is most of the population, the increased anxiety is setting off a lot of the hypervigilance and symptoms. We're seeing people spending less time engaging socially, and without those connections, they're trapped more with the thoughts, and without the distractions, a lot more is coming up in terms of working with early trauma as well. So I've definitely, a majority of the referrals that I've gotten have been looking at both anticipatory grief and trauma work in terms of life changing with loss of jobs, loss of family members, loss of social connections, as well as really looking at people just taking a deeper look into the struggles that they've been facing for years, and recognizing the importance of mental health and treating some of these issues.
Absolutely, that makes sense. Thank you, Meg. Well, thank you again to all of our panelists and all of our attendees for joining today. As a reminder, the presentation is eligible for 1 social work credit, so please keep your Zoom session open as soon as we hang up so you can access the eval, which I believe is also linked in the chat right now. And once completed, as a reminder, please allow about 2 weeks for you to receive that certification via email. If you do not receive it, please let us know and we will circle back on our end. So as a little announcement, Caron Treatment is also excited to provide some additional CEU opportunities. We'd love to have you again on Wednesday, the 31st at noon for another important topic entitled The Importance of Secure Attachment to Long-Term Sobriety. That will also be eligible for 1 social work credit. And then next Tuesday, we're having an evening presentation starting at 8 p.m. entitled Celebrating Creativity and Sobriety in the Time of COVID-19. And that will be in celebration of Neil Lasher, who is a dear friend and colleague of Caron, who passed away about a year ago. And that will feature some great musicians who are also advocates for recovery. Unfortunately, it will not be eligible for a CE, but we do encourage you to share with colleagues or patients who especially have a passion for music, as it will definitely be an inspiring experience. You can always visit our website at www.caron.org/webinars at any time to see a list of all of our upcoming webinars, if any are of interest for you. The last announcement I will make is on Tuesday, April 13th. We are hosting a virtual open house, which is very exciting. I personally am looking forward to this. We have recently launched our Grandview Women's Program up in Pennsylvania. So we will have an opportunity to, again, virtually walk through the program, see it, and connect with some of our key leadership. And certainly ask any questions that you might have about that specific gender-specific program. So that information will come via email. So you can look in your email and sign up if that's of interest for you. And as a friendly reminder, please feel free to reach out to any of the local regional resources directors by you at any time for any additional information, resources that might be needed in your area, or any questions that you might have regarding Karen. We are always happy to help. Thank you again so much for joining us. We wish you health during this season and have a great afternoon ahead. Take care.